Today, for our TBR HR edition, I'm excited to interview Steve Pezim. Our topic today is Decoding Leadership inside the world of executive search.
Thank you very much, Naren. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Steve, you have been recognized by everything from the Business Insider to, publications and even like entrepreneurs, like you are the reason that they became who they became, or you are somebody as like the leader when it comes to executive search, right? Especially for tech companies. Of course, you work beyond tech, but that has been a place you have been focusing on for like decades now. So why don't you share in your own words, what got you excited about technology and helping technology companies and founders? When did you first start? And like help us walk through and get to today, 2023.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, I've always had a fascination for technology as a consumer. And it was just a natural area for me to gravitate to. And this goes back, almost 30 years when I first started. And it actually began working with consumer electronics companies and aerospace and defense companies. And as software was starting to become more and more popular in the 90s and onward, I started to gravitate towards working with early stage and high growth technology companies in software. This also started to get me involved with venture capital and private equity companies and working with their portfolio companies. So I've always been fascinated working with companies at these various stages: pre-revenue, high growth, and enterprise. And where I've been able to contribute is working with founders, private equity, human resource executives to identify, attract, and retain executive talent, usually at the C-suite and the leadership teams supporting the C-suite.
Thank you for that, Steve. I know of actual stories of you coming in and like literally there's one particular person I'm thinking of. I'm not going to name his name or his company's name because I don't have his permission, but yeah. He was, I think I knew him from, like, again, as long as I've known you. I first met him when he was running $1 million business. Yeah. And I believe when he was doing around 10 million, I think he came to you. And today that business does 300 million. Of course, that was a few years ago, and he exited that business, and he's a very happy man and, very successful because of what happened in that journey. And in that particular example, you helped build out his entire executive team that took and scaled the business from doing 10 million to hundreds of millions in revenues.
Yes.
So today we're going to be sharing three types of stories or three problem sets. First is, okay, you are running a PE firm or you are a founder. You put a lot into this particular business, and this business will make or break you. You put millions of dollars, or you put 20 years or 10 years of your life. And you need to find that right CEO, the right leader to take it to the next level. I mean, you know the horror stories and you have seen success stories. So let's kind of dive into that story first, and then we'll talk about a few other scenarios. So let's start with that story, like, hey, high stakes, do or die, that one leader. So what are some of the things that, anyways, I'll let you start speaking and I'll ask questions.
So we had just completed a search for a European client that had a large presence in North America for a technology company. And we put a CEO into the job, and this was a bigger company that he had worked for previously. So he was very excited to take on this bigger responsibility. 30 days into the job, I'm sitting with him in New Jersey, and I'm asking him how things are going. And again, he's talking about all the positive things. And then I asked him, is there anything else that we can talk about? He said, well, confidentially, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. And I said, well, what does that mean exactly? And he said, well, there's really nobody I can talk to as a CEO. I can't go to my board. I can't go to my leadership team. So this is really the first time I'm able to talk to you. So I was playing the role of an executive coach. And he said, my challenge is that my boss is super smart, and he keeps giving me more and more and more to do every week. And it's only been 4 weeks. And I've got 11 projects already from my boss. And I said, well, how's that going? He said, I'm drowning. And he said, the truth is, I don't want to say no to him because I don't want to disappoint him. And I said, I get that. but you're going to drown and you're going to fail. So what you really need to do is just pick the top 3 projects that you think are the highest priority projects, communicate to your boss that this is what you're going to focus on, and then give him a roadmap of how you're going to deal with the other 8 or 9 priorities. Because if you don't do that, you're probably going to have another 3 or 4 priorities in the next week or 2, and you've got to learn how to manage your boss. And he said, you know, I kind of know all this. So this isn't really a revelation, but it's an important conversation for me to have with you because I've gotten lost in trying to please my boss and not doing what you're saying. So he fixed that, and he's now got an even bigger job with a global mandate. So it's taking care of the little things, because the big things are so big, they're obvious, but it's the nuances. And that's part of the role that we play as well.
That's awesome. Now let's look at the search process. So let's say, finding that, finding that single leader, single CEO, or, the key person to drive the business forward. Like, how do you, it's depending on who they're going to be reporting to, there's going to be personality, there's going to be skill, there's going to be all kinds of stuff. So can you walk us through, perhaps based on your experience, just take us behind the curtain, so to speak?
Sure. I'd be happy to do that because, I think we do some things that we refer to as our special sauce. And I think this is where I really do believe we do things better than any of our competitors. And I'm happy to speak about that. So when we begin a search mandate, we have a 4-person team that we assign to every project because we believe teams outperform an individual. And I also like the diversity of thought. So as the partner, I would lead that search. I would have a senior consultant working with me who will assist on the execution and the outreach to candidates. We'll assign one of our internal research people that'll do the candidate identification and mapping. And then we have an admin person that does all of the documentation and coordination of interviews, both internally and externally with the client. But let me walk you through the process a little bit, because there's some things we do that no one else does. And I think this really speaks to why we have a 96% completion rate and an average stick factor that's approaching 4 years on all of our searches, meaning the candidate stays approximately 4 years, which in our world is quite significant. So one of the things we do, and this goes back more than 20 years ago, and it resulted in my frustration of working with tech CEOs that didn't know what they didn't know, were being advised by private equity and venture capital, spend, spend, spend. Just keep spending money and get market share and don't worry about profitability. Just keep spending. And I remember thinking to myself, isn't there a point where you have to make money? Like, isn't there one day where you have to start to make money? So
you have to grow up.
Yeah. So we developed a process where we forced consensus with the CEO and his or her hiring team. And we started by examining 4 areas of leadership, because we found most searches, when they went wrong, it went wrong at the very beginning, not at the end. It was because the CEO or the client could not really articulate what they wanted. It was like, I'll know it when I see it. And so we needed to develop a toolkit so that I didn't have to try and just extract information, and we needed to be able to prompt our client and give them help to articulate what they're looking for. So we developed 4 areas that we look at on every search. We look at strategy, day-to-day execution, emotional leadership, and inspirational leadership. And each one of those categories have 15 competencies. So in a digital online exercise, we take the CEO and his or her selection team, if there's more than one person, we look at each of these areas and we ask the team to select 2 competencies from each bucket. So we end up getting 8 competencies. These are non-negotiable, role-specific competencies. And then once we've got those 8 and we force consensus to get to those 8, we ask the team, okay, you chose this particular competency. How will this leader deliver this to the business in the next 12 to 24 months? What's it going to look like? Talk to us in hard business deliverables. of how this role is going to deliver that competency. And now we've got the team talking about deliverables tied to each competency. And then we draft questions around that, customized questions that are given to each shortlisted candidate. So it's a laser beam of focus on leadership competencies, key business deliverables, customized questions, and we give these to each shortlisted candidate. So we're really using a laser beam focus on all of our searches. We're also doing an audit on your culture, because in our world, when an executive fails, it's usually heavily tied to organ rejection. You know, there's a lack of fit between the client and the candidate. Candidates don't get stupid on Monday. You know, so usually when there's an issue, it's a lack of fit. So we want to understand, what is the culture today? And when we say culture, we mean, what's it like to work here? If your best friend was at this company and said, hey, Naren, I'm thinking of joining the company, what's it really like? It's what you would say. It's how things get done. So we have a diagnostic we do on culture, and we want to understand, where's the culture today and where is it moving to meet the demands of the business. We also have an audit that we can do around, we call it, why do you stay? And for first-time clients, we like to meet people in their organization, not just the CEO and the leadership team, but people in mid-management, other people in the organization. We want to understand, why are you here? What keeps you here? And that's really important, because this is part of telling the story that we're going to use in attracting a passive candidate. Something else that we do, and we've only been doing this for the last year or so, maybe a little longer, and it sounds so obvious, but nobody else does this. We like to take a video of the client talking about the business. So we'll ask the CEO or one of the senior members on the team, talk about the business, talk a little bit about the role, talk about, you know, what excites you about the business today. And we embed that 2 or 3 minute video into the position profile. And it's helping to bring that profile to life. Instead of just a 2-dimensional white piece of paper online, we're putting some personality into the position profile. And a lot of candidates say to us, you know, that really helped me to decide that I want to look at this a little deeper. I like the person I saw on screen. I think I could work with that person. I like the way they communicated. So that's some of the upfront stuff that we do. We build a scorecard, and we scorecard every candidate against a customized scorecard for that each individual search. We have a deep profile that we write on every shortlisted candidate that includes strengths and weaknesses and motivations. I like to sit in with the client when they're doing their first round interviews, because I don't know how much time you've been trained on how to interview. Chances are, you're like most CEOs that I work with, you've never been formally educated on how to interview.
Correct.
And I listen to so many CEOs that think an interview is them selling. Let me tell you about my company. Let me sell to you on why you should join us.
Right.
Because you're used to selling. But I'm used to interrogating somebody in an interview. So it's really important for a client to learn, this is how you successfully interview. And these are the kinds of questions we should be asking for this role. Did you have a question on that? It looked like
I do. I was just thinking as you were speaking, this is wonderful stuff. So I think that structure, that 20 or 30 years of experience, all boiled down into the process you have come up with, that I assume you keep refining even to date, you know, reduces the chances of failure, right? Like you said, like
it's all about mitigating
organ rejection.
It's about mitigating risk and preventing organ rejection.
Preventing organ rejection. What are some examples of things going right? Maybe one example, and perhaps an example where things didn't go right and what you learned from it.
Sure. Well, I'll give you an example of things going right. So one of our venture-backed technology clients, had been given a big check. I think it was about $20 million. And the mandate was grow a world-class company. And this was a bankable CEO who had already had 2 other exits, and everybody knew this guy can do it. We met with him and we were engaged on multiple roles, but the first role was, I want you to find an 800-pound sales gorilla. I want a sales beast. And this person is going to be selling to enterprise. And you tell us what we have to do to get the best athlete. So we developed, a very specific strategy, which we do for every search. And then we shared with our client, these are the companies we're going to go to, and we're going to identify who's in the role, who's next in line, high potential. And we're also going to look at where are the former people that were in this role. They ended up hiring an outstanding executive. And within 4 years, they went from 0 to $120 million US. And they had an exit just under $500 million. And it started with the 800-pound gorilla. And then we put in the rest of their executive team. And I've continued to do work with that CEO as he's gone on to other companies. So that's a success. Now I'll tell you about a failure. And again, I'm keeping these founders specific. So I'm working with a very successful founder who says, I want to replace myself. And I said, well, that's not going to be easy. And he said, well, I want to focus on strategy and M&A. And I'm always thinking about new ideas, and I'm bored. And I know how to do what I'm doing, but it's like rinse and repeat, and it's like Groundhog Day. And he said, I don't want to keep doing this. So we went through our process, built the profile. We identified, over the course of several weeks, we identified a number of outstanding shortlist candidates. And out of the blue, the client calls me and says, Stephen, I've got somebody I want you to meet. I think he might be a good candidate for this job. So because this was such a senior particular search, I jumped on an airplane. I'm going to meet the candidate. I'm sitting in the candidate's living room in his house, and we go through a 3-hour interview. And I'm saying to myself, he's a very capable and qualified person, but I don't think he's the right person for this job. And I don't think he's going to be the right fit with our client in terms of chemistry and culture and values. What I later learned from my client was he was very attracted to this person because A, it was the cheapest candidate, it was the least expensive candidate, and he thought this person would look very good to the public markets because our client was running a public company, and he thought this person would show well on Bay Street and on Wall Street. But I might add, he would have been the least experienced and least accomplished candidate from our shortlist. And I wrote a 1.5-page evaluation, including the reasons why I didn't think this person would be appropriate. Our client hired him because he never saw a deal he didn't like. Fast forward 1 year later, and I've had regular touch points with the client and the candidate. The candidate says to me, Stephen, I just can't take this any longer. He says, I've tried to quit 3 times. And every time I try to quit, the founder just gives me more money. And we're talking big money. And finally, after 3 of these examples, the candidate quit. And the client kept giving him money because the client didn't want to be publicly embarrassed. And they were always like this with each other. They just weren't getting along. So the client calls me and says, Stephen, I think I'm going to have to replace this guy. I said, well, I told you he wasn't the right guy. Did you ever look at this letter I sent you? He said, yeah, I guess you were right. So that one just didn't work out. It was unfortunate to watch. And I have sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the lesson here is that of course, these founders are very successful, so they probably have a lot of big ego and they believe they're right all the time. So is the lesson here that, if you are in this process, being open to coaching, being open to different ways of looking at things can be very helpful, just because you may have seen 10 horror stories and 20 success stories versus that person hasn't. So they don't have that perspective.
I think that's part of it, because this is what I do 24/7. So this is all I do. I'm a one-trick pony that knows how to do this, reasonably well. So yeah, we're dealing with people. Of all things, we're dealing with people, personalities and motivations and ego and greed and all sorts of things. I'm thinking about a crypto company that I was working with. And I kept saying to them, because they were leaning towards this one candidate that we had not identified. We did not recommend this person. And they kept going to this person and they kept saying to us, this is the best candidate for the job. And we said, well, he might be the best candidate, but he's not the right candidate. And you need to distinguish between what's right for your business versus what's best. And this client just decided, I've got to have the best. And as a result of having the best, it ended up failing.
When you say best, on paper, looked like the one that scores high, but it's not a good fit for this particular role.
The issue we had was this particular individual had never worked for an entrepreneurial company.
I see.
This person came out of big corporate background, big profile, and he had been fabulously successful in a big machine. But now this was asking him to go into a smaller company, entrepreneurial run, did not have the resources or the processes that he'd been accustomed to. And my direction to the client was, there's a very high propensity of failure the first time somebody goes from big corporate to entrepreneur. And just think about that, because we think you're taking on a risk that you don't need to take on. Here's a short list of people that have performed in founder-led entrepreneurial companies. They've all had successes. They may not have the same pedigree. They may not be as publicly known, but their track records speak for themselves. Our client was attracted to the shiny object. So the client said, no, I want that shiny object, and that's what I'm going to do. So they hired the shiny object. Shiny object was gone within a year. Client called us back and said, maybe I need to try this again, and maybe I should listen to you. That's up to you. So we got it right the second time. Lesson learned, an expensive lesson was learned by our client.
That's thank you. Let me switch gears for a little bit. Now let's, wear the hat of the candidate, right? So for example, I know a lot of founders, they do their thing, they get the business to a certain level, and then they exit for whatever reason, right? Because VCs get involved and, they need a liquidity event and they move on. Now they're looking for the second gig, or they could be a seasoned professional CEO. This is what he or she does, works for a company for several years, gets it to a certain place, and then goes and does it again. Talk about the other side of this equation, because there's two parts to this equation, right? You have the candidate and you have the client who's hiring you and hiring the candidate.
Well, a successful executive search has to be a win-win. The candidate is hiring the company and the company is hiring the candidate, when you think about it.
Right.
So we spend an equal amount of time getting to understand the candidate's story, motivations, strengths, weaknesses, because it's got to be a win-win. And I'm thinking of an example right now where we're working with a technology company, private equity backed, Canadian company, sub $10 million. And they came to us and said, we need a diversity candidate for this role. Now, most of our searches are diversity searches today for all the obvious reasons we know. And this particular client said, look, I know I'm not supposed to say this, but I'd really like to have a woman if we can, because I look at my leadership team and I'm sitting around with a whole bunch of, middle-aged white guys. And we just really have one consistent perspective on everything we're doing. And it's not bad and we're doing okay, but I've got to change this up. So we went to market and we had a preference for finding people that had this background, ideally diversity candidates, even better female. We found someone, she was working in a company that had acquired her previous company, and her motivation was that she really didn't enjoy being in this big machine. She really recognized that her strength was going back into an entrepreneurial company where decisions were made faster, where she would have more responsibility. And we were able to introduce her to the client. And even though it was less money than she was currently earning, she was very excited about getting back into an environment where she felt she would be most successful. And the trade-off for her was, I'll take less cash, but I want some upside on equity. Fast forward, it's been 2.5 years. That company was acquired, and she did very well financially, and it met all of her requirements professionally as well as financially. So I think she made a wise decision, and it wasn't about the money, but it ended up having a really nice reward for her at the end as well.
Right. Right. So
I'll make one other point I want to make, and this
yeah.
is something I've also learned over decades. The time to consider an opportunity is when you don't need it. Because you're going to be very objective. You're not going to be emotional or as emotional. You know, you're really in a position of strength. So I'm thinking about a search that I'm doing right now, and all of the candidates that I'm talking to, you know, they're doing well. They're still on a fast track. They're enjoying what they're doing. And my communication to them is at least get all the data and then make an informed decision. I truly believe this opportunity is better than where you are today, but you won't know that unless you put your foot in the water and you meet this client. And then I need to coach the client on how to manage this meeting, because you're dealing with a passive candidate that doesn't need the job. So you can't just sit there and go, so tell me, Naren, why do you want to work for us? Why should we let you join our company? Because that's not going to be a successful strategy.
Right.
It's really learning what's going to motivate each side and what are the important things to talk about. I don't know why this just came to mind, and you'll decide whether you want to keep this in or edit it out. But I was dealing with a fabulously successful tech entrepreneur. And same thing, he told me that he needed a diversity candidate. And we agreed that the candidates were going to meet this client when he flew in on his personal jet into a private airport in New Jersey. And the first candidate comes in her private jet. And the client, and we're sitting in the boardroom, and the client looks at her, and for the first 20 minutes, all he can do is talk about her jet, because her jet's nicer than his jet. And he just wants to know, you know, is that a Gulfstream 5 or a Gulfstream 6? And she says, it's a 6. And he says, that's pretty amazing. If I can get my market cap up to this, I'm going to get one of those. And I'm sitting there going, guys, we only have an hour. We should talk about this. And we got them talking about what they need to talk about. And they actually ended up doing a deal together. And he never got that jet. Whenever we talk, we always talk about the first 30 minutes, we're talking about the jet.
I was going to say, I know you have this framework, like you talked about the 4 different dimensions, and you interview them, you find the 8 attributes. When you coach candidates, I assume some candidates you have worked with in multiple careers, right? Multiple roles they have done. Is that a framework or a way to look at this if you're on the other side?
You mean building a relationship with someone like me so that it's like a repeatable?
Right. No, what I'm saying is like you have people you may have placed in multiple roles. Like when you coach them and they perhaps have become friends, like when you coach them on getting that ideal next job, and they, you know, is there certain things they should be looking at very carefully in deciding or thinking about that next opportunity?
Yes. And I would say to you, in my experience, most candidates don't do a very good job of interviewing their potential boss. They're focused on answering questions, and they're not coming as prepared as they could be coming to those meetings. And I'm always recommending to candidates and to clients that we need to carve out some time in this meeting for the candidate to ask their questions, because it's a two-way street. And I see a lot of candidates that have negative surprises, because they assumed that there would be aspects of the job or the company that would be similar to what they've experienced in the past, and those things don't always happen. So it's an important time to get everything on the table. Don't make assumptions, and make sure you really talked it through. You got to do a lot of dating before you get married. And I'm not there to slow down the process, but if I've learned one thing over thousands of searches, it's that the best shortcut is thoroughness. Just be as thorough as you need to be. And if it means more meetings, then take more meetings. This is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And I see a lot of companies and candidates get into trouble because they're trying to sprint. And I don't recommend it. Right.
This is one of those things, better go slow than fast, because going too fast can really cause a lot of negative implications down the road.
I really do believe that. I mean, when you're making an executive decision, whether you're the executive or whether you're the company executive, you want this relationship to last for years. And it can't just be about, well, I've got a hole in here, I need to fill that hole, so there's a warm body, let's put them in there and see how it works out. That's not what executive search is.
Understand. Steve, I have a lot of friends who are looking for people at this very moment, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners probably are looking to hire some serious people to fill their executive team. If any of them, or even perhaps a candidate who's looking for that next opportunity, wants to get a hold of you, wants to have a conversation with you, what do you suggest?
Well, so just to be clear, I'm always interested in good candidates, because we can't complete a search without good candidates. But my focus is working for the client company. So I'm very careful with my time, because if I said, sure, I'll talk to anyone that wants to talk to me, I will spend 60 hours a week talking to people that may not be the right people for the searches I'm working on.
Fair enough.
My priority is client focused. Develop a strategy, and then go after the athletes that we have to go after to fill that particular role. So it's really more client focused than candidate focused in terms of my time. We will spend an average of 150 to 300 hours on one search. We will probably reach out to more than 100 candidates on a search. Sometimes it's hundreds of candidates on a search, and then we filter down to maybe 10 to 15 interviews, and then we filter again down to 4 to 6 candidates for a short list. There's one other point I wanted to make that we hadn't touched on in terms of process that I think is really important, and that is, I'm a big believer in doing a deep dive on references. And it's amazing to me, even today, how often a company will call me and say, we really didn't do a deep enough dive on references on the last candidate. We can't afford to get it wrong this time. So when we explain to them the type of referencing we do, we want to speak to, it could be board members, peers, subordinates, customers. We want to speak to people, up and down in the organization to do references on someone. It's really important to know how well this person performed, how this person is thought of. We're doing social media references. We're doing credit checks, criminal checks, education validation. It's amazing how often we see people that may not tell us all the truth, or may have actually misled us on their resume. So it's really important to do that. The other thing I would say is, I'm a big believer in psychometric testing. Again, I wouldn't put more than a 5 or 10% emphasis on the decision based on psychometric testing, but the more data, the better. And we share this information with the client and with the candidate. So it's It's kind of like doing a test to understand, how does Naren show up for work every day? What motivates him? What could potentially derail him? And then we share this information with client and candidate. It's really useful information, and we don't do searches without doing this.
2 follow-up questions. This psychometric testing and references, do you do it at the shortlist level, or like once you have the final candidate, like the one that they really like?
Usually the finalist or the 2 finalist candidates.
Okay. Thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate you and your time and your wisdom. And actually, you've tried to give us what you've learned in 30 years in, I guess, 40 minutes or 45 minutes. I appreciate that. So your website, is that the best way to kind of learn about your company, Bedford Group?
Yes, yep, bedfordgroup.com. And I really appreciate you giving me some time today. And it's always good to talk to you. And I'm always available anytime you need me.
Thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate you and your friendship and, of course, your wisdom. For all of the listeners today, thank you. If you like this podcast, please share it on social media, perhaps LinkedIn, perhaps in a group that you belong to. Maybe some of your colleagues might also learn a few things from this conversation that I had with Steve. And also write a review for us. Reviews like yours will help other listeners find us and hopefully listen to the podcast as well. Till we meet again, have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you. This is Naren, your host.